Okay, the name of the parsha, Vayikra, means and he called, Vayikra and he called, and is found in Leviticus 1:1. It's also the name of the book. Vayikra is the name of the parsha and the name of the book. Vayikra is and he called. God calls to Moses from the tent of meeting and communicates to him the laws of the korbanot, which is offerings, the animal and meal offerings brought in the sanctuary. And there's many different categories. Most of this parsha has this various different categories of offerings. The first is the ascending offering, which is olah, which means go up. That is wholly raised to God by the fire atop the altar. Then there is five variations of meal offerings, mincha, prepared with fine flour, olive oil, and frankincense. So that's flour. And then you have peace offering, shlamim, whose meat was eaten by the one bringing the offering after parts are burnt on the altar and parts are given to the Kohanim priests. So whereas the olah, the first category, the elevation offering, was all of it was offered on the altar, all of it went up to God. When it comes to the peace offering, the priests the priests eat some, the person who brings the animal eats some, and the temple and some of it is offered on the offering, which is a symbol of God eating some. So that's the second category. Then we go to the third category. The different types of sin offering, chatat, brought to atone for transgressions committed erroneously by the high priest, the entire community, the king, or the ordinary Jew. So this is interesting. We talk about sin offering for different types of people who commit a sin. Now, what's interesting is we start with the leaders because in some ways it's most important that the leaders realize that it's possible for them to make a mistake. We start with the high priest, the entire community, which is the high court, and the king. And in fact, when it comes to the king, it's like what the leader says, Asher Nasi Echta, which is translated if the leader sins, but really the word Asher is when the leader sins. In other words, it's almost inevitable. But in any case, after we talk about the leaders making mistakes and therefore having to bring a sin offering, this also mentions the sin offering of the ordinary Jew. Okay, and then the final category, which is a subcategory of sin offering, would be the guilt offering, asham, brought by one who has misappropriated property of the sanctuary, or who is in doubt as to whether he transgressed a divine prohibition, or who has committed a betrayal against God by swearing falsely or to defraud a fellow man. So in other words, there's a few specific categories of sin that are not included in the sin offering. Rather, they are included in the asham, in the guilt offering. And that's essentially the parsha, various different types of offerings, which we can talk about and discuss and elaborate upon and see what the mystical meaning is and what the psychological meaning is. So that's the journey. Of course, we have to talk about the introductory verse, which is also very powerful. The journey begins. Go ahead, Dr. Tamron, please.
Rabbi, I understand the historical context of these offerings, but so much of what you teach us, and which has to do with Kabbalah, and which has to do with the spiritual and psychological underpinnings of everything you teach us, has to do with personal transformation. I'd like to know how in the world does someone who sinned bring an offering of an animal? How does that transform the individual at all?
So that's a very good question. It's about animal offerings and about sin offerings, but really all offerings. Like, what's the point of an animal offering? If you think about it, um, God doesn't need to eat breakfast or eat lunch. What would be the purpose of this? And that's a very good question. I don't even know where to start with this answer because there's all different kind of perspectives. So let's start with the most radical perspective. The most radical perspective on this is none other than most radical perspective, I mean, within traditional Judaism, would be the Maimonides in the Guide to the Perplexed, in his Moreh Nevuchim. So Maimonides has different types of works. Most of them are interpretations of halachic texts and then codifications of the Talmud. But he also wrote a book of philosophy. And his book of philosophy, he writes as a guide to the perplexed. There are people who were immersed in Greek philosophy, and therefore they have trouble with certain precepts of the Torah. So he set out to explain how these things can be consistent. He doesn't accept all of Greek philosophy, but accepts a lot of it. In short, what Maimonides says in the Guide to the Perplexed, because one of the sections of the guide is he looks for rational interpretations for the commandments. And but he says something which is quite famous, but quite radical, and most of the this was rejected by virtually all the other classic commentators. But Maimonides says like this: He says, "Look, idol worship, sacrifice really is not necessarily a positive." And what happens was that in those days, people were all immersed in idol worship. And the pagans offered idols to their gods. I'm sorry, the pagans offered offerings to their gods. And that was part of the culture. So the Torah cannot say, okay, no more animal sacrifice because it was just too common. It was part of life. Everyone did it. So what you have to do is the Torah tries to limit it and says, well, you only bring offerings in certain circumstances and you only do it in certain times. And the goal is to wean people away from idolatry and to eradicate idol worship altogether would not work. Therefore, we say, you know what, bring specific offerings in specific times, and that's how it will be limited. So that's what Maimonides writes in the Guide to the Perplexed. And virtually all the commentators like are I don't even know what the right word is are they reject it like completely. And one of the people who reject it is Nachmanides. And Nachmanides says that cannot be the interpretation because if you look back in the Torah, you see that already Noach, when he comes out of the ark after the flood, he offers offerings, and at that point, there's no idol worship. And there it says that God smells the aroma, which it says in this parsha too, which we have to discuss what that means. But God smells the aroma and says, "No longer will I bring the flood." So we see that the offerings are very powerful. And then you have the story of Abraham. Okay, Abraham is a different story. Maybe there was idol worship in Abraham's time. But in other words, we see that the idea of idol worship of animal offerings precedes the concept of idol worship. So the question is, back to Dr. Tamarin's question, what would be the purpose of offerings? Before we talk about a sin offering, but in general, what would be the purpose of offerings? And Nachmanides puts forth the following theory. Nachmanides says like this: when a person brings an offering of an animal, the purpose is not to offer the animal. That's not the purpose. There would be no purpose. There is no purpose in offering an animal. The purpose is for the person to come close to God. And the animal is the meditation. In other words, a person says, when a person brings the animal, a person has to see and feel as if really I would be bringing myself. Just like the story of the binding of Isaac. If you go back to the story of the binding of Isaac, which is a troubling story, but either way, God tells Abraham, bring your son as an offering. And we all know the end of the story, which is this, at the last moment, God said, don't harm your son. We all know that part. But what happened right after that? People, they just got because the relief is so profound. Oh, he's not going to be killed, Isaac. So we forget to listen. The end of the story is Abraham lifts his eyes and sees a ram and offers the ram instead of his son. So in some ways, every offering is that model. Every offering is, I'm offering this animal instead of me. Really, I should be close to God. If you want to get graphic, my blood should be on the altar, et cetera, et cetera. Really, I should become close to God. This is Nachmanides. I'm not saying it's the only interpretation, but that's what Nachmanides says. And therefore, the purpose of the offering is that what happens to the animal is an expression of what really should happen to me. And that obviously is shocking, and that obviously would grab people's attention and bring them close to God. Now, because this is so, this explains.
Rabbi, can I ask you a strange question?
Yes, go ahead.
Why don't they just say something like you have to cut off a finger?
Oh, because God doesn't accept that. God doesn't accept that.
Okay, so you can't cut yourself. You
No,
can't actually do any damage
no, you're
to
not
your
allowed to.
body.
Correct. You're not allowed to do any damage to your body. You're not even allowed to do things that for example, tattoo the body, because in our view, the body belongs to God. You can't. So God doesn't want. God wants life, and God wants the person to be complete. So just like the idea is, somebody says, "I want to come close to God, but I can't. I could bring the animal as the symbol. Now, we have to understand that this is hard for modern people to accept. So I'm not accepting you to accept this, let's just go through the process and then you tell me what you like, what you don't like. Now, this explains a very interesting thing about the offerings, which is that if you open up the prophets, all throughout the books of the prophets, there are all different verses where God tells the prophets are speaking to the people and telling the people, God doesn't want your prophets. Lama li rov zivchechem. Isaiah says, why do I need all your prophets? God doesn't want your offerings. He doesn't want your sacrifices. In fact, there's a verse that says, I never commanded you to bring offerings, says God. I only commanded you to be kind to the poor. To paraphrase. He says, what? God never commanded us to bring offerings? The entire book of Leviticus, all it does is talk about offerings. Right? So what does this mean? So what it means is as follows. We always talk about the idea that in Judaism, the action is the most important thing, and the intention is secondary. Intention is important, but the intention is secondary. But there's only one exception to that. The exception is offerings. If you bring an offering and it doesn't change you as a person, if you bring an animal sacrifice, it doesn't change you as a person, then there's no purpose in the offering. Because the entire purpose of the offering is to create the meditation. So if it's not creating the meditation, then it has no value whatsoever. And that's why the prophets say God never wanted these offerings. He never wanted the offering. It says so in the Torah. Yes, but when the people were just offering the offerings just because that was ritual, but that didn't represent their internal transformation, then the prophets, all of them, say God doesn't want this. So it's very different than all the other mitzvot, where in every other mitzvah the action is important because the action has inherent value. Over here, the intention is important. And that expresses itself in many, many laws. There's all kinds of strange laws about offerings, which seem inconsistent with Judaism, but once in this light, they make sense. For example, there's a mitzvah that there's a prohibition, something called pigul, which means disgusting. But the point is like this: if I bring an offering, and while I bring the offering, I have a bad intention, which is, let's say, for example, every offering has a prescribed time when it can be eaten. So if I bring an offering, I either have to eat it in 1 day or 2 days. Okay. What happens if while I'm bringing the offering, I have an intention that I'm going to eat it in 3 days? Not a crisis. I say 3 days from now, my kid's coming home. I'm going to save him a piece of steak. Not the end of the world. That's called, right? At that point, the offering is disqualified. Even if I didn't keep it over for 3 days, if I keep it over for 3 days, it's a separate prohibition. No tar, leftover. You can't eat leftover. You can't allow the animal to be left over. But you see what I'm saying here? While I didn't do anything wrong. I just had an intention that I'm going to eat it late. It's disqualified. And there's so many laws about sacrifices which put the effect on the intention. In other words, when it comes to sacrifices, the intention is not secondary. The intention is primary. Now, you could say today, to the modern people, we have difficulty to feel why would I have to kill an animal to get this intention? Okay, I'm not that's a separate discussion. But the point is, we say, what is the purpose? The purpose is to evoke this image within myself that I am being brought closer to God. Now, why do I be closer to God? For all different reasons. So we can get into that. We can unpack this. But that is the first thing to say. The first thing to say is that I'm bringing myself close, and the animal is just a symbol. God doesn't need the animal. I don't need the animal. And if I bring the animal and I don't bring myself, and it doesn't create transformation within self, there's no point of the animal. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi. You said that it's important to have a proper meditation when bringing the offering, right?
Yes.
But today, offering of the animal, today it's replaced with the prayer. So does it mean that it's important to have a proper intention when praying, or if you
The
just...
short answer is yes. The short answer is yes, that prayer, more than any other mitzvah, intention is critical. Now, what exactly does that mean is a different story. We all understand that you can't pray, or when you come to service that's 2 hours long, you can't have intention the entire prayer. It's very difficult. And therefore, the sages say that they really break it down that the most important times to have intention is the first sentence of the Shema and the first paragraph of the Amidah. And theoretically, if I did not have intention, I should have to repeat it. But then they say, you know what, don't repeat it, because if you repeat it, you're probably going to forget to have intention the second time either. But theoretically, yes. Theoretically, prayer is about awareness. Now, when I say you have to have intention, there's another debate. What does intention mean? Intention doesn't it could mean I have to understand what the words mean, which would be nice. But there's more of a basic intention, which is I realize I have an awareness that I'm talking to God. And if I do not have that awareness, some people would say, not practical, but some people would say, then that's not really prayer. So there has to be a baseline. In other words, when you eat the matzah, if someone comes to my house, never heard about Pesach, never heard about God, never heard about Egypt, no problem. I say, you know what? Eat this matzah. Just eat the matzah. It's a good cracker. It's healthy for you. And they eat it, they fulfill the mitzvah. They have zero awareness. Every other mitzvah, the action is the mitzvah. But prayer, if I tell someone, just read this, they never heard of God, they never heard of anything. I say, just read these words, and they read it, it's not prayer. Because you're alluding to this thing that prayer is a substitute for offerings, and in offerings, the intention is not secondary, the intention is primary.
Thank
So
you.
the short answer is yes.
Yeah, thank you. And also very important idea about the overarching intention, like if
Yeah,
you
yeah,
love God, even if you don't understand all the details, that the
correct.
intention counts. Thank you.
And I'm standing before God. I'm talking to God. What exactly I'm saying, if I understand what I'm saying, or don't, if I'm thinking about it, I'm not thinking about it, that's secondary. But the awareness is important. Yeah. So that's
And I'm
the
assuming I can't find that where I raised my hand on this stupid thing.
okay. We want to hear what you
uh,
have to say.
Ben, just hit react.
He's driving. Don't hit anything. Don't
Oh
hit.
no,
He
no, no.
drives.
Don't
Keep
no,
your
no.
eyes on the
And
road.
don't hit anything. It's right.
React isn't on there this time. It's usually there, but it's not.
All right,
I don't
good.
know
Oh, but
why.
it's a self-driving car,
Stay
so it's fine.
stay safe. You're driving.
It is a self-driving car. So my question was on when I see people who are the Chabad people will say, "Have you wrapped tefillin?"
Yes.
And so the action is the wrapping of the tefillin, but they also make them say
Yeah.
the prayer,
Yeah.
when they do it. And most of the time, these people have no clue what this prayer is or
Right.
what it's about. And
Right.
so there seems to be a duality there, and maybe you could just address
Yeah.
that.
So I would say the main thing is the tefillin. If I stop a Jew and say, put on tefillin, say, I have no time to pray, I said, no problem, just put on tefillin. That's a self-standing mitzvah. I'll speak for myself when I put on tefillin with people, and I've been doing it since I was 12. I would say the first sentence in Hebrew, maybe the first paragraph in Hebrew, but always, always, always give them the English siddur and say, read this in English. Because if it's praying, intention matters. So that's that I could only speak for myself, but the idea is that tefillin is the main mitzvah, that we stop people in the street to put on tefillin.
But you could just have them put the tefillin on
Yes.
and
Yes.
not
It's
say
its
the
own
prayer.
mitzvah, 100%. It's its own mitzvah. We're saying you're already here. You may as well say a prayer. Why not? It's double points, not points, whatever.
Yeah,
It's an extra mitzvah. But
No,
tefillin is the mitzvah. It's a self-standing
that's
mitzvah.
really,
Correct.
that's
Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin, please.
Rabbi, I'd like to talk about the issue of durability and duration, because as you've told us, feelings are transient. And if you have an intention could last 1 second or it could last a lifetime. So is there any distinction made by Maimonides, Nachmanides, or the Rebbe about the issue of the duration of intention? Because we talk about transformation, etc. Transformation sounds like something that doesn't happen for a second. It sounds like something that's durable. So I'd like you to address the issue of the durability of intention versus the momentary aspect of intention.
Yeah, so I want to say two things about that, and I want to, and in other words, two theoretical and then one practical. Okay, so let's start with the theoretical. There are certain rituals that are related to the offerings, and again, when it comes to offerings, not all the mitzvot are explained. So some things are just like accepted on faith, or what the Torah calls a chok, a decree. Not everything is explained, but then there are interpretations that try to give insight into the meaning. So there's at least two things in the offerings that highlight the idea that the purpose of this is not for a one-time inspiration. Come to the temple, pay tribute to the gods, God, because we only have one God, pay tribute to God and go home and keep doing what you're doing. And one very interesting example, I say it's interesting because it also spills out into Jewish life today, would be a very interesting mitzvah. And this mitzvah itself has multiple interpretations, which we'll get to later, but I just want to talk about this one, the durability issue. And that is the mitzvah that every single offering, all the different offerings have different rules and different laws, and every offering is different. But the one mitzvah that every single offering has in common is that every offering has to be every offering that's offered on the mizbeach, on the altar, must be sprinkled with salt. Al kol korbancha takriv melach. On all your offerings, you should bring salt. And that's a positive and a negative. But lo tashbit melach b'Yisrael Elokecha. Do not hold back the salt of the covenant of the Lord from upon your offerings. So we have a positive mitzvah to bring every offering should have salt, and then you should not bring an offering without salt. So, and by the way, that's why today, one of the reasons today that on Shabbat when we break bread, we dip it into the salt. Why? Because the Talmud says that now that we don't have an offering, now we don't have a temple and we don't have an altar to atone, says the Talmud, a person's table atones for him. In other words, in some ways, we could talk about the mysticism of this maybe in a few minutes. In some ways, whatever the offering achieves, now you achieve when you eat lunch, which is very strange, but very fascinating. But all of a sudden, we're going to start drawing parallels between a person's own table, your dining room table, your kitchen table, and the altar, which is the table of God. So now what happens? So if God says, God likes salty food, God says every single dish has to have salt, then we too, when we're going to make the blessing, we dip the bread in salt. It's not the only reason. Another reason is also that you want it to be tasty. If you're saying a blessing on the food, it should be tasty. So you want it to be salt. Once in a while, I'm going to stop all the recordings. Once in a while, my wife forgets to put in salt into the bread. It's a whole different experience. So you want challah in your salt. You want salt in your challah. So the simple answer is you just want it to taste good because it's a meal. It's because you're saying a blessing on this bread. You want it to be tasty. But the spiritual answer is that no, when we break bread on Friday night or Shabbos and we dip it into the salt, because this is reminding us of the fact that in the temple every offering had salt. Now, why did every offering have salt in the temple? To say God likes salty food. So why? It's not healthy. It's not good for your blood pressure. So there's all kinds of interpretations, at least two, maybe three. But one interpretation is what Dr. Tamar is alluding to. What is salt? In the ancient world, the only preservative, is that what I say? The only preservative or some element that preserves food is salt. They had no refrigeration. You couldn't freeze. If you want something to last, you put on salt. So in the ancient world, salt is synonymous with preservation. I say the word salt, what you really mean something that's going to last, because that's what they would do with salt. The fruit they would dry, whatever could be dried, but meat, for example, has to be salted if you want it to preserve. So what the Torah is really telling us is every single offering, which is offering, you can't offer whenever you want. Offering is an extraordinary experience. You have to go to the temple. You have to leave your house wherever you're living in Eilat or you're living up north. You go to the temple. You offer an offering. It's an extraordinary experience. But the most important thing we say is, what's important is the salt. Can you preserve some of this feeling? Maybe not the full intensity. Could you preserve some of this feeling and take it home and help it change the person you are? And that's one place where you see that the preservation is critical. There's another place which another idea where the commentaries point out, at least some of them point out, that the Torah, I alluded to this verse earlier, that already when we come back to Noach, it says that God smells the pleasing aroma. And again, God says, offer these offerings. It's a reach nichoach laHashem. It's a pleasing aroma to Hashem. Now, what's so pleasing about the aroma? I understand that sometimes a barbecued meat smells good, but does God need the smell? So again, that's something else. Rashi already addresses this, and he says the aroma is not the aroma of the burning meat. That's not the aroma. The aroma is God smells. The word reach could be nachat ruach, could be pleasure. God gets pleasure that he said a commandment and the people keep it. In other words, it's not that he likes the smell, he likes the idea that people are keeping the commandments. But other people point out and they say that what is a smell? A smell is very interesting because to taste something, you actually have it in your mouth. You're internalizing it. Smell is really an indicator of what is to come. If I walk into the house and I smell a good dish coming from the kitchen, all of a sudden I get excited, my heart rate goes up. Why? Not because I have the dinner right now, because smell is an indicator of what is to come. And the commentaries say, so what is so pleasing? What's the pleasing aroma of the offering? Why does God like the offering? Not because God likes the offering. The offering is just the aroma of what is to come. What is to come is the change or the closeness of the transformation within the person. So these are the two symbols, the idea of the salt as a preservator and smell as an indicator of what is to come, that represent that the goal is not the offering itself, the goal is the change. Now, then so we understand that the change is very important. Now the question is, how do you change? And change is not a simple matter. So the Jew, I think it's the Jewish way, but certainly the Hasidic way highlights it, that dramatic change doesn't always work. And more often than not, and I think this social scientists understand this today, more often than not, change is not even dramatic. Even if a person needs to make dramatic change, the way to do dramatic change is by changing habits and starting with very small habits. So it's not so much of I'm going to come back from the temple. I went to the temple. I brought the offering. I want to be inspired. I want to live a more meaningful life. So I'm going to change my whole life. I'm going to throw everything out and become a new person. That almost never lasts. Even if a person could do it, it does almost never last. It's much more likely that change would be what change. And by the way, this is not just spiritual change. This is also health changes. I want to change my lifestyle. Okay. So what are the few very small, seemingly small, but accumulative habits that I could say, because I had this experience, what am I going to do? How am I going to change? Let's say I had this experience. I went and met my brother and I want to change. I want to reestablish my relationship. Okay. So I'll call him once a month. It's small, but it's accumulative. And I think that's how that's how change happens. But the point is that the inspiration, Dr. Tamarin is correct. The inspiration is overrated. The inspiration only works if you have your salt, if you can preserve it, if you can take it home, and if this could be an aroma, which is an indicator to what is to come. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. Is that why we bring some sacrifices like 2 times a day, like twice daily to
Yeah. So there's this idea. Yeah, go ahead.
To get in the habit and form that connection on a regular, like by repetition?
Yeah, Judaism is into habits. Now, it happens to be that Vicky's alluding to the communal offerings, which are not spoken about in this parsha. This parsha is individual offerings. Individual offerings, every person would bring either because they choose to or because they want to. We could talk about the different offerings or because of a sin. But the bottom line is, but yes, there is but broader, if you want to talk about offerings more broadly, there are the extraordinary offerings that we bring, what we call musaf, the additional offerings that you bring on a special occasion. Shabbat, there are additional offerings, and holidays are additional offerings. And then there's the once in the morning, once at night. And by the way, not just the offerings, also when it comes to Torah study, there's a verse that says, "V'hagita bo yomam v'layla." You have to study Torah always. You have to study Torah day and night. So I'm going off on a tangent here for 1 minute, but bear with me. You have to study Torah day and night. What's day and night? All day and all night. Yeah, but I have other things to do. Okay, so go do the other things. But when you finish, come back and study. Yeah, but I also have to go on. I also have to take a walk so I can have peace of mind. Okay, take your walk. So ultimately, any free moment you have a mitzvah to study Torah. That's at the max. But the minimum, it's morning and night. So the Talmud says, even if someone just says one sentence in the morning and one sentence at night, they fulfill that obligation of learning Torah day and night. So the scholar is studying 23 hours a day. And the guy who's busy, so he just says Shema. He says you can do it with Shema. You say Shema, because Shema is a prayer, but Shema is a verse in the Torah. So you say Shema once in the morning and once in the night. That itself, you fulfill the obligation to study day and night, right? Because the point is, in a way, it's not so much how much you do, but more important is the consistency. And it could be very small, but if you do it consistent, you do it day and night. You always do it. Always? Yeah. If you always do it. If you do it every day, it's always. Right? So what does always mean? We have that verse Tamid in the next parsha. And Rashi has this thing, but everything you do, anything you do every day is always. You always? Yeah, you always. Right? What is always? So the Judaism is a big believer in the power of small steps, but that they are consistent, and the power of habit. And today we understand that willpower is overrated. It's very hard to change based on willpower alone. Some people could, but willpower gets weaker and it's a muscle. And if you strain it too much, it's not going to work. But habit is where the change takes place. Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin.
Rabbi, since I met you, I always ask you to contemporize things.
Oh, yeah.
And so with the indulgence of the others here, I have a wonderful example of a sin, which I would like to ask how you, as the Rebbe's disciple, would address it. And the issue is this. I have a patient who has a 7-year-old girl. She's a lovely child, and in cahoots with some other kids, it wasn't her fault, they brought a salt pill in, and they were going to put it in another girl's glass of water.
Oh
The
my.
school, all right, the school finds out about it. They didn't do it. The school stops it. And what they did is if she was a high school kid, they would have expelled her. Instead, they basically gave her a leave of absence, and she's home now. And they're willing to take her back with a doctor's letter saying she's not going to do it again. But I would like to know, since this is a sin of a 7-year-old girl who basically didn't realize what she was doing, what would the Hasidic and what would the Rebbe do if the 7-year-old kid or the parents came to him in Brooklyn with this dilemma?
So this is very interesting, even before we get to the problem. So I just want to understand. So the punishment is for the intention or for the action?
Well, the action never took place.
Okay, so that's interesting. That itself is an interesting discussion, right? It's very in Judaism. There are, with few exceptions, we don't necessarily punish for intention, right? It's not like in America conspiracy. I sat around a table and someone said to do something. I said, you know what? Let me do something, and that's a crime, just like as if I did it. Really, just because I want to do something, it doesn't mean I'm going to do it. Like in Judaism, it says that when someone does something that has a good intention, God considers it as a mitzvah, but as if it was done. But a bad intention, not necessarily. Who said I'm going to do it? Maybe I will, maybe I won't. So that's an interesting discussion in itself. There are a few exceptions where intention would be a problem, but usually that's interesting. That intention is it's
It's
intention.
considered a sin.
It's not necessarily considered a sin because intention is
Well,
normal.
these people, the school considered it a sin.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Look, you have to. I'm not the greatest educator. The first thing I would do is speak to my wife, honestly.
No,
But
but I want to know what the Rebbe would say to
but
this
but, but the
7-year-old girl.
concept would be what are we doing to incorporate sensitivity into this person's life? What are we
Right.
doing?
That's the point.
That's the question. Now, exactly
That's
how to do it is probably depends on the person and the age and the circumstance. But that would be the goal. The goal is to move close. We talked about this in the past, but sacrifices is not the punishment. You know, when you translate it as sacrifice, which is the incorrect translation, it sounds like we have to exact pain and exact suffering to get the message, right? To have you get the message that we have to punish you because to realize that if you're going to come close to God, it's going to has to cost you something. But that's not what the offering is. That's not what korban means. Korban means coming close. Coming close means you're coming close to the person you want to become. In other words, you're moving toward the goal of what you want and what's desired. So I think that there has to be something that will help people, this girl or the other girl, or the class. But in other words, to cultivate sensitivity to other people. That's what I would say.
so, Rabbi, in effect, instead of suffering,
Right.
basically the goal should be to educate her in the direction of empathy.
Correct. Correct.
Okay, so we've got so in a way, one approach to sin is to cultivate empathy rather than suffering.
Yeah, the thing is you want to say what is the correction. In other words, you want to say, how do I become a different person? How am I going to become the person who would not do it again? Not because I'm afraid of the punishment, because not always would there be a policeman to catch me. Okay, so this is a little bit about offerings in general. There's so much to say about the introduction of even just the first verse, but I want to skip all of that because we talk about it every year, and maybe we'll go back to it in a few minutes. But I want to say something that I also say every year, but it's still very important to understand, and that is talk about the three general categories of offerings, even though that are in this parsha. And Dr. Tamron wants to know how this applies to our life. So this is going to once we get to the core of what exactly is supposed to be happening here. I think we could. I think we'll see how even if we're not bringing the sacrifices literally, but the teachings is very relevant to our life as well, our relationship to God, but maybe even our relationship to other people. So when we read the nutshell, it gave you 5 categories, but those 5 categories essentially, really, if you want to be a little bit more general, are really 3 categories, and we like the number 3, so we're going to stick to 3. What were the 5 categories that we had in the nutshell? We had Olah, elevation offering, which is the entire animal is offered on the altar. You slaughter it, and you offer the entire animal on the offering. Then there was a subcategory of meal offerings because the meal offerings are different. There are also elevation offerings, but that's sort of a subcategory as elevation offerings. So we'll put that into one, elevation offering. And then is what they call the peace offering. And the peace offering is an offering that one of the reasons why it's called a peace offering is because it makes everybody happy, because everybody gets to partake. The priest gets a piece of the meat. The god, meaning the altar, gets a piece of the meat, gets a piece of the animals that get burnt on the altar, and the person who offered the offering gets a piece of the meat to eat. Now, by the way, that's a very Jewish offering. It was not a common offering. Maybe it exists, but usually in the pagan cultures, that's not an offering. An offering is you want to appease the gods. You want to bribe the gods. So you give a gift to the god. It's not like but you're giving a gift to God. You don't you don't eat part of that offering. The whole idea is you're giving up to God. So this is a very Jewish thing that the person is making peace with God and the priest, and we're all eating together from the same offering. It's a very unusual category of offering. In other words, that's unique. It did not exist in the other cultures at that time in that area. And finally, the last offering, it would be the sin offering, and we had the guilt offering, which is, I don't want to say a subcategory, but it's both when a person does something wrong. So in that sense, it's part of the third category. So in other words, elevation offering, then you have peace offering, and then you have sin offering. That's the three categories. Now, what does it mean? And what is the hierarchy? What is the order? Which one's greater? Which one's less great? So here there are different ways to spin this. I'm going to try to first just be very objective in how I describe the three. And then we'll become a little bit more subjective and say there's different ways to look at the hierarchy of which one is greater. So the first one, I'm going to try to be very factual, just sort of selling these different categories based on the properties that they have and based on what the Torah tells us about them. Okay, so what is elevation offering? Elevation offering is the entire offering is given to God. I'm giving myself up entirely to God. In a way, if you want to think about this, I'm losing myself completely. I want to become completely spiritual. Think about Abraham who wants to offer himself to God or offer his son to God completely. That's Olah. It's all about God. So complete devotion, complete spirituality, complete devotion to spirituality. And that's an elevation offering. By the way, why does a person bring an elevation offering? There's no reason. There's no reason given. Adam ki yakriv, the first category in this parasha, it's called a nidava. It's a gift. I didn't sin. There's no holiday to have a peace offering. I want to come close to God. I want to feel that I'm coming close to God, that I'm subsumed within godliness. I want to feel that I'm coming close. So I bring this animal to represent the fact that I'm completely submitted to God. Or it's aspirational, that I want to be completely submitted to God. But the point is, it's absolute, it's strong, it's complete. I'm completely submitted. I'm giving myself over to God completely. That's the elevation offering. Peace offering, right away, you see, it's peace. I'm making peace with God. Yes, I want to serve God, but I also want to eat dinner. I also want a piece of steak. That's peace offering. God is happy and I'm happy. We're making peace. It's beautiful. And then the sin offering is, well, I did something wrong, so I have to rehabilitate the relationship. These are the three categories. Now, the way I said it, it sounds like the first is the most spiritual. Person is completely devoted to God. Wow, what could be better than that? The second is less so, because I want to have a relationship with God, but I also want to enjoy some of the steak. I also want to enjoy myself. And then the third one is, of course, it's the worst. It's the lowest. I succumbed, I sinned, so I have to say I'm sorry. So I'll bring an offering to God. And that's one way to read it. But the Hasidic way to read it, perhaps, is exactly the opposite. In other words, yes, of course, a person wants to become close to God completely. There are going to be times that everybody wants to feel spiritual. So you bring your offering. But the Hasidic perspective would argue that's easy. It's very easy to say, I want to run to the synagogue on Yom Kippur. I want to fast. I want to forget about everything. I want to turn off my phone. And I want to be completely devoted to God for this period of time. That's easy. The next offering is actually much harder. Make peace with God. Connect the spiritual and the physical. That when I'm eating my steak, when I'm eating the offering and I'm enjoying myself, I understand that this is part of a spiritual connection to God. So you're not escaping the physical, but you're sanctifying the physical. That's very Jewish. That's what I mean. That was not how ancient cultures or any cultures viewed God, viewed holiness, viewed religion. Religion was about transcendence. Religion was about running away from the physical world as much as possible. And anything you're going to do in the physical world is just only because you have to. So you are accepting the limitations of the physical life. So you have no choice. You have to succumb to your needs and you have to eat lunch. But in Judaism, in Judaism is the opposite in a way that the ultimate goal, yes, sometimes you want to be completely devoted to God. Yes, on Yom Kippur, you want to be like an angel. But in a way, it's easy to be an angel. It's very easy. It's relatively easy to be an angel. To be a human being, that's much more complicated. To say, I'm going to be in the physical world, I'm going to eat the steak, I'm going to be involved in my physical needs, but I will do those in a sanctified way. And this is going to be part of my relationship with God. And I'm doing this because God wants me to do this. That's a step up. In the first reading, it was a step down. But in this reading, it's a step up. Making peace. You're bridging heaven and earth. That's much more complicated. And say, you know what? I'm just going to devote myself completely, and I'm going to offer myself completely. That's much more complicated. And then finally, the sin offering, which could look like the worst, maybe it's the highest. Why? And we talk about this all the time. I think we talked about it last week, last Tuesday, I think. Or maybe we didn't have a class. I don't remember if it was Tuesday or Friday. I think it was Friday. But then this idea of what is the idea of a sin, and what does the sin offering represent? So this is a very powerful notion that, in a way, people look at a relationship where nobody ever sinned and say, wow, that's the best relationship. Look at these people. They married for 70 years. They never fought. Okay, it's very nice, but that's not the most powerful relationship. The most powerful relationship would be that there was an obstacle, there was tension, there was setback, and yet they were able to overcome. That means that the relationship is stronger than the obstacle. But if you never had any obstacles, who's to say what's going to happen when the relationship is tested? So who has a more profound relationship? The couple who never fought, or the couple who fought and overcame? That now we know, even if people didn't fight for 90 years, it's no problem. But we have no idea what's going to happen when there'll be tension. What's going to happen when a person's going to have to dig much deeper and it's going to be painful and they're going to have to dig deeper to overcome and create and rehabilitate the relationship. So we don't know. So if you by this reading, just to summarize, by this reading, the Torah seems like it's getting bad to worse. In the beginning of the parsha, someone who's completely devoted to God, he didn't do anything wrong, and all he wants to do is come close to God. So he brings what they call a nidava, a donation of an elevation offering representing the fact that I want to be completely submitted to God. So and then I go down, going downhill from there. And finally, at the end, there's all the list of sins. I did this wrong, I did that wrong, and I therefore have to bring this offering or that offering. So when you read that side, it's one big sliding pond. We start at the top and we go down. But if you put on the Hasidic lens, it's the opposite. It's easy to want to transcend. And sometimes you should transcend. And when you say the Shema once in the day, or twice a day, because you're supposed to say at night as well, you cover your eyes. And the reason why you cover your eyes, one of the reasons is to say, I don't want the input from the physical world because I'm connecting to the truth. I'm connecting to the unity. I'm connecting to the oneness of God. I don't want to see the multiplicity of creation. I want to see the true essence. The true essence is only one. So I cover my eyes. That's elevation offering. That's complete. I'm completely submitting in this 10 seconds. That's relatively, it's hard, but that's relatively easy. The next step would be, okay, how do I make peace? Yes, I have a spiritual life, but how am I going to have a peace offering? How am I going to eat my lunch, eat my steak? And that's going to be part of a spiritual experience. That's much more difficult. And finally, the most difficult is I did something wrong. There was a setback. How do I dig deeper and say, my love to God is so profound that even when I had this challenge, I can overcome the challenge. And that's how the Parsha is not sliding down, but it's building up. And that's the story in short. A lot more to say. Of course, we're going to say more. We still have plenty of time. But I think if you want to talk about what are the big ideas of the Parsha, the three big categories of sacrifices, I think this is very relevant to everybody in our relationship with God, but even relationship to other people. Because when you have it, you fall in love. It's very easy to say, okay, I'm just going to do for the other person. But sometimes it's much harder to negotiate. But what about me? I also have to be part of this relationship, right? It's much easier to say, yes, I'll just do whatever you want. But that's not the goal. That's step one. Devotion is step one. But ultimately, there has to be a balance of giving, but also maintaining what I need. And that would be the peace offering. And then, of course, there's the idea that when something challenging happens, there's the idea I could look at it as that's the end of the relationship, or that's a calling to dig deeper and rehabilitate the relationship. And if I could do so, not always can I, but if I could, then it's actually the most profound relationship. So this model would be true for the human relationship with Hashem, but also with other people. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. I completely agree because admitting the sin is very difficult. So it's probably the most valuable sin offering. I'm not sure which order it is in the Parsha, but I was just wondering, can you give an example of the sin that is it like sin between person and Hashem, or this is the sin between people and person and somebody who didn't get caught and he admitted, because there is a different level of difficulty for
Yes, yes.
between.
There are all kinds of differences, and some it's both. It's both for against other people or God. The difference is that sometimes you don't bring a sin offering because there's categories. In other words, if the Torah gives you a way to correct it, in other words, it only applies to a negative mitzvah that has no punishment and has no way to correct. So, for example, if I steal, I don't have to bring a sin offering because I violated the commandment, but there's also a positive commandment of how to correct it, which is return the theft. And if I'm caught, I have to return double, right? So we're talking about, so Maimonides lists, or the Talmud does already, but Maimonides codifies this, and it lists the exact number of sins where there's a sin offering. And also these sins are by mistake. Remember, if it's on purpose, the sin offering doesn't work. Then you have to have other ways of repentance. But sin offering, the guilt offering, by the way, the guilt offering are the failings that are on purpose. But only a few of them you have a guilt offering. But the sin offering, the idea is by mistake. And the idea is, am I responsible if I did something by mistake? And the answer is, in a way, yes. That's another story. Because I say, I forgot. Well, that's a problem that it's not so important to me, right? You come home on the anniversary and your wife says, "Oh, you didn't buy me flowers." So the wrong answer is to say, "I forgot it's your anniversary," because that means that's a bigger sin than forgetting the flowers. You forgot the flowers is one thing, but you forgot that it's anniversary, that's a bigger sin. So the point is that saying "I forgot" is not always an excuse. In fact, it could be an aggravating factor, right? And I remember the first grade, I forgot my homework. I'm still traumatized, so I'll say it. The teacher said, "Did you ever forget your pants?" He said, "No, you never forgot your pants." So why? Because that's important to you. So I don't know if that was the smartest thing to say to a first grader. But the point here is that, when it's sin offering, it's not all sins, it's specific categories. But if you want to talk about the big picture, what's the conceptual concept? The conceptual concept would be that, in a way, the highest level is the person where there is a setback and then you can overcome. And that's what the Talmud says. The Talmud says that in the place where people who return to God stand, even the greatest righteous people cannot stand. In other words, a Baal Teshuvah, someone who returns to God, is greater than the person who never sinned. Why not? He never sinned. He's in love with God. They're still having their honeymoon. They're married 50 years. They're still on a honeymoon. They never got into a fight. Okay, but then the question is, how impressive is that? The person is not challenged. What happens when a challenge will come up? What would happen if a challenge would come up? Are these people strong enough to overcome the tension? You could engineer tension out of your life, okay, but that's not telling you about the depth of the relationship. The depth of the relationship is this can survive tension. That's a deeper story.
So is it a separate category of a guilt offering?
Yeah, guilt offering is a specific category of things that we do on purpose. And the question is, what is so important about those sins that you have a specific guilt offering? And the commentaries address those. What's so important? What is so important about those specific sins? And why are they fundamental sins that need their own category? A lot of them there's different, there's two examples that I remember is, for example, if somebody is subpoenaed to testify, and then he says, "I don't know, I don't have any testimony." And then they swear they don't have testimony, and he swears he doesn't have testimony. That's like a guilt offering. That's one example. Another one is someone swears that he doesn't owe money, and he does. So these are categories that are basically the foundation of trusts within the community that will allow for civil life, either for commerce or for loans. In other words, there has to be a basic premise that we trust each other. And if you don't trust me, I'll evoke the name of God and I'll promise that I'm saying the truth. And that's sort of bringing in God to regulate the affairs of society. Now, if I violate that, it's basically a low trust society. That means we can't trust each other. Even when you take an oath, I can't trust you, or you can't trust me. And that's terrible sin, not only because it's a specific sin, but it's a general sin. Because in a society that has low trust, you can't create anything. right? It affects commerce, it affects everything. So in some ways, that's the worst crimes. It's not so much the specific crime is so bad, it's not so bad. So there are worse sins than promising that I'm saying I don't have any testimony for you. Big deal, right? No, but this is the whole idea that you trusted me as a witness when you took a loan from them, when you loaned somebody money. If I'm not going to come up and produce that testimony, then next time you're not going to loan anybody money, right? Or not going to make any other transaction. So in other words, it's not so much a severity of the sin, but it's how this is these sins cut at the fabric of society. If you talk about those that last category, I'm just going to open up the screen. What we have here, we have doubt. That's another problem. Someone who's in doubt. So misappropriate property of sanctuary. Yeah, so we could talk about why those are so important. But the last two is what I mentioned is swearing. Whoops. The last two is the swearing falsely to defraud a fellow man, and it's also yeah. So we can talk about these specifically, but that's the big picture. Okay, let's open up the first verse of the first verse of the parsha and the third book. And all the commentaries talk about this verse, and we could talk about this for a very long time. We only have about 4 minutes left, but we'll jump in. Why not? Now, there's so much to say about it. But we have to start somewhere. Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin, please.
Rabbi, by the way, I always ask you this question because it turns out to be relevant. What's the word in Hebrew for sin? Because usually we talk about the fact that sin is very relevant in Christianity, but Jews don't think so much about that word sin. So what's the word because we're talking today about sin offering.
Yes.
What's the word for sin in Hebrew? What does that word really mean?
That's a great question. I'm right now Googling. I want to know in English, what is the etymology of the word sin in English? Sin, violation of divine law, offense against God, moral new. Okay, so in English, I'm looking at, I have no idea what this website is, Edema Online. So it's the etymology of the word sin. Middle English, sin, from Old English, sin, violation of divine law, offense against God, moral wrongdoing. Also, injury, mischief, enmity, guilt, crime, misdeed. These are the words associated with sin. Now, in Hebrew, it's very interesting because chet is very interesting. It's not the most terrible word you would think of. In Hebrew, chet is very funny. If you have, let's say, what do they call those people who shoot arrows? Archers? Is that the word, archer?
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm sorry?
Yes.
Yes.
Archer.
So in Hebrew, when you want to say the archer hits the mark and doesn't miss, you say the archer hits the mark and doesn't sin. In other words, sin, the etymology of the word sin means you missed the mark. Doesn't mean you robbed the bank. It doesn't mean you did something terrible, you murdered somebody. But sin means that you're misdirected. You have the goal, you have your purpose, you have the positive effect of what you're supposed to do, but you were distracted. So you're off the mark. That's what sin is. It doesn't have to be that it's not saying that you're a terrible person. And it highlights that you have the purpose and you have to now realign with your purpose. So sin is misalignment. That's what the etymology of sin is in Hebrew. So it's like missed opportunity would be sin more than the actual sin. Right? So it's not so much that I sin, it's like I didn't do what I was supposed to do. Rabbi Darren always says this. He says that once upon a time in the 50s, the yeshiva students in 770 got into a lot of trouble. Without getting into the story, I don't know the story because he never says the story. But the point is the Rebbe was very, very upset. And the Rebbe said, why was he so upset? He wasn't so upset because they sinned. They're teenagers. Teenagers sin. He was upset. Why do they have time to sin? They should be busy with what they're supposed to be doing, studying Torah. So in other words, sin is misalignment. Sin is you have your purpose, and the moment you're not focused on what the positive thing to do right now, that's a sin. What do you do is a separate story. It doesn't have to be that bad. In other words, sin doesn't highlight so much that you're so terrible and the deed is so terrible, because sometimes the deed is not terrible. It's just for you at this point, you should have been doing something that is more aligned with your goals. So that's interesting. That's interesting of what the word sin would mean. And of course, the word sin itself, because by its etymology, reminds us that we have a purpose and we have direction. And by the way, intention in Hebrew is kavanah, it actually means to aim. To be aware is to aim. So sin is you misfired. In other words, you're off the mark. And intention is focusing on your mark, focusing on your purpose, focusing on where you need to be. So these are two sides of the coin. Sin is misalignment, and intention is alignment. Attention is aiming to my purpose. Sin is when I stop aiming at my purpose. Okay, so thank you for that. That was a good way to end. I think everybody should align with their purpose and continue moving forward and doing good and making peace. The most important, like I said, in some ways, the most important offering, the most Jewish offering, is not the elevation offering. Many people want to escape. Many people want to transcend. In Judaism, we have moments of transcendence, but what's unique to Judaism is not the elevation offering, but the peace offering. Could you come back? Could you sanctify your lunch? Could you eat the meat in the context of holiness? Could you make peace between heaven and earth? That's the goal, and that's what we do. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.